The document on the kitchen table wasn't a bill. Vivian Crane found it there on a Tuesday morning, folded once down the middle, sitting next to her father's coffee cup like it was nothing. Like it was a grocery list or a note about the weather. She almost didn't pick it up. She almost poured herself coffee and walked back to the barn and let whatever it was be someone else's problem for another hour. She picked it up. Her eyes moved over the words slowly, the way you read something when part of you already knows what it says, and the other part refuses to believe it. Agreement of transfer. In settlement of the debt owed by Harmon Crane to Leland Voss, the undersigned agrees to the following terms. There were more words after that, legal words. Words about property and obligation and compensation. But Vivian's eyes had stopped on her own name, printed in the middle of the page in plain black ink. She set the paper down. She picked it back up. She read it again. The kitchen was warm. Sunlight came through the window over the sink and fell across the floor in a long gold stripe. Outside, she could hear the horses moving in their stalls, the sound of her younger brother Eli doing his morning chores, the creak of the barn door on its hinges. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 5 minutes ago. Nothing was the same as it had been 5 minutes ago. Her father came in from the back porch, stomping mud from his boots, and stopped when he saw her standing there with the paper in her hand. "Vivian," he said, "don't." Her voice came out flat. She didn't recognize it. Harmon Crane was 53 years old and looked 10 years older. He had the hands of a man who'd worked land his whole life, and the eyes of a man who'd lost at it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her the way he always looked at her when something bad had already been decided. "The bank was going to take the ranch," he said. "Everything. The land, the cattle, the house. Your brother would have had nothing, so you gave them me instead. Leland Voss isn't a bad man. He's 41 years old, Papa. He's a fair man. He runs a good operation down in Sulphur Creek. You'd have a roof, a real kitchen, land that isn't underwater in debt. I'm not a debt payment." Harmon looked at his boots. He didn't say anything else. That was the moment Vivian understood that the conversation had already happened without her, in some room she hadn't been invited into, and the paper on the table was just the part she got to see. She walked out of the kitchen. She walked past the barn, past Eli, who called her name and got no answer. She walked to the far fence line and stood there with her hands on the top rail and looked out at the dry brown hills and the pale morning sky and tried to think of one single thing she could do. She was 24 years old. She had $42 in a tin box under her bed, which wouldn't get her to the next county. She had no family beyond this ranch. She had a brother who was 16 and who needed the land their father was about to lose. She had a name on a piece of paper that she hadn't signed. 3 days later, a man she'd never met came to the ranch in a wagon. Leland Voss was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall and weathered, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a way of holding himself that was careful rather than large. He wore a plain gray coat. He took his hat off when he came to the door. He looked at her father first, then he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, almost too quickly to catch. Something that looked for just a moment less like a man completing a transaction and more like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. "Miss Crane," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. That was the whole of their introduction. The ride to Sulphur Creek took most of the day. They sat on the wagon bench with 2 feet of space between them and didn't say much. He asked her once if she was cold. She said no, he didn't push it. The landscape rolled past. Brown grass, limestone outcroppings, a hawk riding a thermal so high it was nearly invisible. She watched it until it disappeared. When they reached the Voss ranch as the sun was going down, she looked at it carefully, the way she'd been taught to look at things she might need to understand. It was a real operation, not wealthy, but solid. The fences were in good repair. The cattle she could see in the lower pasture looked healthy. The house was 2-story, wooden, with a porch that ran the full width of the front and windows that were clean. A woman came out to meet them. Miss Aldrich, the housekeeper, 60s, gray-braided, who looked at Vivian with an expression that was not unkind and said, "I'll show you your room." Leland said, "You must be tired from the road. We can talk tomorrow." Vivian didn't thank him. She followed Mrs. Aldrich inside. Her room was at the end of the upstairs hall. It had a window that looked east toward a line of cottonwoods, a quilt on the bed in faded blue and white, and a small writing desk in the corner. It was nicer than her room at home. She hated that it was nicer than her room at home. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the dark. She did not cry. She had made a decision, somewhere on that long wagon ride, that she was not going to cry where anyone could see her, and she was going to hold to that decision even when no one was watching, because she didn't trust herself to know the difference. The next morning, Leland Voss was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He had coffee already made and eggs in a pan, and he didn't say anything when she sat down, just set a cup in front of her and went back to what he was doing. She drank the coffee. It was good coffee, which she noted and said nothing about. You can have the run of the property, he said after a while. I'm not going to put rules on where you go or what you do with your time. The only thing I'd ask is that you not leave without telling someone, because we're 10 miles from town and I'd rather know if something happened. She looked at him.
That's all? For now. What does that mean, for now?
He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man thinking up an answer, the quiet of a man deciding how honest to be. It means I'm aware that you didn't choose to be here, he said.
And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing and finished her coffee and went outside. She spent the first week watching. That was how she dealt with new situations. She learned them before she engaged them. She walked the fence lines.
She watched how the hands worked the cattle. She noticed that Leland rose before dawn every morning and was usually the last one in at night. She noticed that he spoke to his crew with brevity but without harshness. She noticed that he stopped to close a gate that one of the younger hands had left open, without saying anything about it to anyone. She also noticed that he never came into a room without making some small noise first.
A boot on the threshold, a knock on the doorframe, as if he had made a decision, very deliberately, never to startle her.
She didn't say anything about that either. At the end of the second week, she found him in the barn after supper, working on a bridle that had come apart at the stitching. She watched him for a moment from the doorway. Do you have another needle? She said. He looked up. In the tin on the shelf. She found it, found thread, sat down on the other side of the workbench, and started on the section he hadn't gotten to yet.
They worked in silence for an hour. When they were done, the bridle was better than it had been.
She went inside.
He didn't say anything. That became a pattern. Not friendship, exactly, she wasn't ready to call it that. But something, a willingness to occupy the same space. A set of small, unspoken rules that they had somehow both agreed to without ever discussing them. She wrote to Eli once a week.
He wrote back in his cramped, smudged handwriting, telling her about the calves that had come in the spring and the roof that their father had finally gotten patched. He never mentioned how things were at home with her gone. She didn't ask. One evening in late April, she came back from a long ride to find a book on the writing desk in her room.
No note, just a book.
A collection of frontier journals from women who'd settled the territory in the 1860s. She sat down and read it for 3 hours straight, and when she finally looked up, the room was dark and the house was quiet. The next morning she found Leland in the kitchen and said,
Where did you get that book?
Had it for a while, he said.
Thought you might like it? Did you read it?
Twice. She looked at him for a moment. Why? He turned back to the stove. Because those women deserve to be remembered, he said, and most people don't bother. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a second longer than she needed to. Then she went outside.
She thought about that sentence for the next 3 days.
In May, she asked him to teach her to ride the big roan that none of the hands would go near. He looked at her, assessing.
She's thrown 4 men, he said. I'm not 4 men. He taught her.
It took 2 weeks and she got thrown twice herself, but by the end of it she was riding the roan across the upper pasture at a full run, and she could feel something loosening in her chest, some knot that had been there since the morning. She'd found that paper on the kitchen table. When she finally brought the horse in and walked to where Leland was leaning on the fence, she was breathing hard, and her hair was half undone, and she was grinning before she could stop herself.
He was already smiling, just barely, like he'd been waiting for that specific grin. She stopped grinning. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was going to say you've got a good seat, he said mildly. That horse doesn't run like that for most people. She took a breath. Thank you, she said, for teaching me. It was my pleasure, Vivian. It was the first time he'd used her first name.
She noticed and said nothing and led the roan back to the barn. The letter from her father arrived in June. It wasn't long. Harmon Crane was not a man who wrote long letters.
It said that the ranch was doing better, that Eli had taken on more of the work,
that there was a young widow down the road who brought them pies sometimes.
It ended with, I hope you're being treated well. I hope you can understand someday why I made the choice I made.
Vivian folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer. She sat there for a long time. She was not ready to understand. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. But she was 24 years old, and she was riding a horse that 4 men couldn't handle, and she'd read every book in Leland Voss's study, which turned out to be considerable, and she had $42 in her tin box, plus 3 months of what he called a household allowance, which she had not asked for and which she had not refused. The question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she arrived finally came forward one evening when they were sitting on the porch watching a storm build to the west.
Why me? She said.
Leland didn't answer right away.
The storm threw long shadows across the hills. Your father's name came up in a negotiation last fall, he finally said. About some grazing rights on the south boundary. I knew who he was, knew the family, knew about you.
From who? People talk. He paused. I'd seen you once before.
At the stockyards in October, 2 years ago.
You were arguing with a buyer about a price he'd offered your father. You knew every number.
You knew what that cattle was worth down to the dollar, and you weren't going to let him pretend otherwise.
She remembered that day. She'd been furious for an hour afterward because the buyer had eventually walked rather than pay fair price.
You watched me argue with a cattle buyer, she said, and decided to make an arrangement with my father. No. He was quiet for a moment. I watched you argue with a cattle buyer and thought about it for 2 years.
The arrangement came later, when your father's situation became known, and when I heard what the bank was about to do. He stopped. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying what happened. The storm reached them.
Rain started on the roof of the porch, slow at first and then all at once. You could have just offered him money, she said. Without my name in it, he wouldn't have taken it. I tried. She turned to look at him. You tried. 3 times, Leland said. He wouldn't take charity, but he'd take a contract. People are strange about their pride.
She looked back at the rain. Her mind was working through it, laying the pieces out in order the way she always did. So you put my name in the contract to make it acceptable to him, she said. And then you drove 10 miles to bring me here and told me I could go where I wanted and do what I liked.
Yes, that's a strange way to buy someone. I wasn't buying you. His voice was level. I was trying to keep your family from losing everything and take on more than I should have at the same time. A pause. I'm aware of how it looks. I'm aware of what that paper said. I can't undo it, but I want you to know that it was never. He stopped. It was never that. The rain came down hard for a few minutes. Lightning walked across the hills to the west. You looked at me differently, she said. When you came to the house. When you first saw me. He didn't answer. Leland, yes, he said. I did. She didn't push it further that night.
But she turned it over in her mind for weeks, the way a person turns over something small and heavy, testing its weight from different angles. August came. The heat was extreme and the work was hard, and she had stopped thinking of herself as a visitor. She knew every hand by name. She could read the South Pasture's water situation at a glance. She'd taken over the household accounts from Mrs. Aldrich because numbers had always been the thing she was best at, and Leland had handed them to her without hesitation, which was either very trusting or very foolish, and she'd decided it was the former. Then the letter came from her father's creditor.
Not Leland.
A different one, a man named Strickland, who had apparently held a second note on the Crane property that Vivian hadn't known about. The letter was addressed to her. It informed her that the arrangement between Harmon Crane and Leland Voss was not legally recognized in the county, that the transfer of a person was not a valid form of debt settlement, and that if she wished to contest the arrangement she had grounds to do so, and the creditor's office would be happy to assist her.
She read it 3 times. She set it on the desk. She walked downstairs and found Leland in the study. I need to talk to you, she said. She showed him the letter. He read it without changing his expression. Did you know about Strickland? She said. No.
Did you know the arrangement wasn't legally recognized? He set the letter down.
I had a sense, he said carefully, that it occupied a gray area. A gray area.
I was told by my lawyer that it would hold as a contract but might not hold as a deed of transfer, because you're not property, which you're not. He met her eyes.
If you want to take this to a judge, you have every right to. I'll stand behind whatever you decide.
She stared at him.
You'd just let me go, Vivian.
His voice was very quiet.
I was never keeping you.
She sat down in the chair across from his desk because her legs were not entirely steady. She thought about $42 in a tin box. She thought about the roan. She thought about a book of women's journals left on a desk with no note. She thought about a man who knocked on door frames and said it was never that in the rain.
What happens to the debt if I leave? She said. I already paid it, he said. 3 months ago. Outright. The arrangement with your father was, it was never the real mechanism. It was the only thing he'd accept. He shook his head slightly. The debt is gone either way. Your family's land is safe.
She was quiet for a long time.
You paid off my father's debt, she said slowly.
And then let him put my name on a piece of paper so he could keep his pride. And then you spent 9 months. Not exactly keeping you, he said.
No, not exactly letting me leave either. He was quiet. Say it, she said. He looked at her. I was hoping you'd stay, he said. Of your own decision, because you wanted to, not because of any paper. The room was very still. That's an enormous gamble, she said. I know. You could have just told me. You weren't ready to hear it. And I wasn't sure I had the right to say it. He picked up the letter and set it down again. I'm still not sure I have the right to say it.
She looked at the window.
Late afternoon sun.
The cottonwoods moving in a small wind. She thought about who she'd been when she came here.
The girl who sat on the edge of a bed in the dark and decided not to cry. The girl who'd spent 2 years watching a woman who knew her own worth argue with cattle buyers and thought something she hadn't let herself name until right now. She stood up. I want it in writing, she said, that the arrangement is dissolved, that I'm here by my own choice and nothing else.
I'll have my lawyer draw it up tomorrow. And I want my name on the household accounts, my actual name as the person responsible for them. Done. She stopped, took a breath, and I want you to say the rest of it.
What you haven't said.
He stood up from behind the desk. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her the way he had looked at her on that first evening on the wagon bench, careful, steady, like a man who has been patient for so long that he barely remembers what impatience feels like.
I've been watching you for 2 years, he said.
The way you know what something is worth and won't let anyone tell you different. The way you learn that horse.
The way you read. The way you fix that bridle without being asked. He paused. I didn't do this right, I know that. I went about it in the worst possible way. But I want you to know that from my side, none of it was about what that paper said. What was it about? You, he said. Just you, since the day at the stockyards.
She stood there for a moment.
That's still a lot to take in, she said. I know. I need some time. Take all you need.
She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Leland, yes, the coffee you make in the mornings, she said.
I was never going to tell you, but it's the best coffee I've ever had. He didn't say anything for a second. Then she heard the quiet sound of him exhaling.
Not quite a laugh, but something close, something that had been held for a very long time. She went outside into the late afternoon. The roan came to the fence when she approached, the big animal dropping her head over the rail in that particular way she had, impatient and familiar. Vivian put her hand on the horse's neck. The cottonwoods rustled. Somewhere on the other side of the barn, two of the hands were talking in low voices, their words indistinct, the sound of ordinary work on an ordinary evening. She thought about a county judge. She thought about $42.
She thought about Eli's handwriting, and her father looking at his boots, and a letter that said, I hope
You can understand someday. She didn't understand.
Not yet, maybe not ever entirely.
But she was standing in a place that had become, somewhere in the months between January and now, hers in a way she hadn't anticipated and hadn't asked for and had slowly, stubbornly, without meaning to, stopped fighting. She wasn't staying because of a piece of paper.
She wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go.
She was staying because she wanted to.
Because the books were good,
And the horse was hers, and the numbers in the household accounts made sense in her hands, and the man who made good coffee had spent 2 years waiting to see if she would choose him, and she had decided, standing at the fence in the long afternoon light,
that she was not in the habit of letting something real go, simply because it had arrived in the wrong way. She turned back toward the house. The door was open.
Warm light from the kitchen window fell onto the porch steps. Inside, she could hear the quiet sounds of supper being made. Vivian Crane walked back through the gate and closed it behind her.